This episode of The Michael Shermer Show is brought to you by Brilliant, the learning platform designed to be uniquely effective in helping you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in math, data analysis, programming, and artificial intelligence. As most of you know, in most areas outside of my professional training, I am an autodidact. I am a self-taught learner. So I'm always in search of new avenues of knowledge, skill, and wisdom in fields I know next to nothing about. For example, a recent course that they just uploaded is on teaching you how LLMs work. You know LLMs, large language models like ChatGPT. For example, if you do this, you'll get hands-on with real language models as you explore how they build vocabulary, choose their next word, and more. You'll understand the importance of training data by comparing models trained on, of all things, Taylor Swift lyrics to models trained on cookbooks or big tech's terms and conditions. You know, those statements none of us ever read? Well, they're important in large language models. So check it out. Go to brilliant.org/skeptic to get a full free 30-day trial and 20% off your annual premium subscription. That's brilliant.org/skeptic. Check it out. I use it all the time. It's a great autodidact tool to learn new things. All right. Thanks for listening. Here's the episode. Okay. My guest today is Nellie Bowles, a writer living in Los Angeles. Previously, she was a correspondent at the New York Times, where as part of a team, she won the Gerald Loeb Award in Investigations and the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Journalism Award. Now she is working with her wife, Barry Weiss, to build the Free Press, a new media company where she also writes the weekly TGIF column, which is released every Friday. Thank God, or whoever. Hi, Nellie. Her new. I forgot to introduce the proper book here. Here's the new book, Morning After the Revolution: Dispatches from the Wrong Side of History. Okay, I read your book. Of course, I read your column every Friday, which is big fun. So what's it like to start a new media company? That's astonishing. You guys did that.
Well, it's first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. And I read The Skeptic, but I actually don't read it in print, and I need to get that print, the print subscription.
We are
one
amazing. Of the few still in print.
It looks gorgeous.
Yes, it is nice. Yeah, we're 4-color throughout now, which is actually cheaper than it used to be when we were black and white, because things have just changed so much. And you know, when we started Skeptic, 1992, I didn't even know about distributors to bookstores. I actually went physically. I went to bookstores and said, "Hey, would you like to carry my magazine?" And one of them finally said,
"That's
awesome. There's companies that do this." I went, "Oh."
That's awesome. That is basically what starting a media company is like. It is going door to door asking for help with something.
Yeah.
To answer your question.
So you're able to do this primarily through subscriptions only, or do you also have donors or investors or?
Yeah. So I guess to go back in time, Bear and I were both at the New York Times. Bear quit with a fiery resignation letter.
I remember.
And,
I know.
and we didn't really have a plan after that. I was still there. I kind of went on leave to gather myself and figure out what to do. And eventually, a few months after Bear had been thinking, am I going to do this or that? I was sort of like, maybe you should be a rabbi. That sounds like fun. But we figured, let's start collecting some email addresses at least. And I had heard of Substack and knew a little bit about the new publishing ecosystem. And so I set her up on a substack.com/Barry Weiss or something like that. Just to collect emails and just to kind of have a distribution platform. And I, of course, set it up so wrong in so many ways. Our first year of accounting is like a real mess. But then people started signing up and the signups were happening a lot. And then we started offering, you can pay for premium content and we'll put something behind a paywall. We'll figure out what. We'll start publishing more. We'll start publishing other people's voices and more Bear. And eventually, very quickly, it was making her New York Times salary and then twice her New York Times salary, just through subscribers, everyone paying $5 a month. And then 3X. And then I sort of was looking at the chart and I was like, I'd covered startups for years. I started the San Francisco Chronicle and then eventually made my way to the Times, where I started as a business reporter. And I'd seen startup charts and I was like, this is a startup. This is pretty exciting. And so I left the Times in part because it was becoming untenable to be there, and because people were making it impossible to do any fun reporting or interesting reporting on the most interesting stories of the day. And I write about that in the book. But I also left the Times in part because what common sense, now the free press, looking at the growth chart, I was like, I can't miss out on this. We got to build this thing. And so I quit and kind of became the first business manager of it, which was a mess, as I've said, with the accounting. And then started a little Friday humor column that I've been doing ever since. And it's very, very fun. And then this week I actually just started a health column too. So now I'm doing also random rants about health and wellness.
I wonder if you
which will, I'm sure, get me in more trouble.
I wonder if you could have done this, say, even just 10 years ago, because the platforms and kind of the norms of people giving $5 a month or whatever became so commonplace.
I think people over the last decade, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, have gotten used to the idea of paying for news and paying for subscriptions. I think early on, there was this kind of a cardinal sin that a lot of publishers just put their content online for free and didn't really think much of it and just thought their print products would continue to be as lucrative as they were. And obviously that turned out not true. But people are really comfortable paying a subscription for writing that they want and content that they want. And that's really amazing. And so you see this flourishing of new voices and this flourishing of, it's on Substack, but it's on a million different platforms that make it very easy for writers who don't know how to do web design or don't know how to do the basics, make it very easy for them to set up a new tiny media company. Now we're sort of a mid-sized media company. If you like, it's pretty incredible.
You're over 1 million followers now, right?
I don't
know how you count
are
it.
Our numbers,
but it's substantial.
Yes, our unpaid list, like our total list, is something like, I think it's almost 900,000 or something. I'm going to get that wrong, but then our paid list is less than that, but is also a lot. And it's allowed us to hire a team, and we're more than 20 people now. We raised a little bit of money at the beginning when we weren't sure it was going to grow this well, and we have sort of spent it over the last 3 years. And me always being the like overly conservative voice in the room, wary of any spending. But yeah, it's grown and it's been great.
Well, it's fascinating. It'll be interesting to see where this goes from here, because one of the things I've noticed is my monthly bills are starting to add up of the number of subscriptions I have. I mean, I have the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post, and then I have a couple of podcasts. Then I have you guys, Schellenberger, Matt Taibbi, and then Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, and it's like, $5, $10, $5, it's like all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute.
It's crazy.
How much more can I do of this?
The worst is Hulu just came at me with, they wanted me to, they're giving me ads even though I pay for Hulu.
Right.
And I had to subscribe to the next tier up. My bear and my dad were watching Shogun, and they gave me a lot of shit. My dad especially for not upgrading us and being too cheap to get the $17 a month Hulu or whatever. But yeah, it's exhausting. And of course there will hit a moment where people get exhausted with all these subscriptions. That is going to happen for sure.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that the Free Press that we're trying to do is to bring together some of the best of these new voices and kind of be a hub for it. So that looks like obviously news roundups, like what I do, but then also it looks like reprints and bringing the best of a smaller subscription product to you and we will, pay the person, we'll reprint it and bring it to our audience. And so hopefully saving people some amount of that subscription fatigue. But no, it's interesting. I mean, I think we're all feeling it.
Yeah. So you were at the New York Times, the gray lady, all the news that fits the print, the paper of record, and you left. That's astonishing. Let me read a little section here from your intro.
It shouldn't be so astonishing.
Well, I'll make it clear here by reading your own section here. You're talking about, well, you wanted to go to Seattle to cover the Antifa movement and the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, Chaz, and your editor, well, you say, I ran into a colleague who was a rising newsroom leader. He said he was worried about me and this. He was worried about what these story ideas said about me and if I was thinking about my career. He was worried I was into all this cancel culture stuff. I said, I'm just so curious about what's going on up there. What else am I supposed to do? He said, that's a question for a therapist, not an editor. Antifa was nonsense, fake, a nothing burger, a non-story, non-interesting and not real, he said. The reason he doesn't go to Seattle and cover things like this is because he knows right now is the time for white people to sit certain things out. Some things that are not important, things shouldn't be covered. The Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone and whatever was going on there wasn't important. Antifa wasn't important. Why do you care? No, but seriously, why do you care? At the New York Times, this is astonishing that somebody would say something like that.
Cast your mind back to the height of 2020. And there was a concerted effort to silence anyone who wanted to do reporting that wasn't completely doctrinaire. I mean, that effort is still here now. I think it's done a little bit more subtly. I think it's done a little bit with a little more sophistication. But in 2020, it was pretty blunt. I mean, you had NPR saying we're not covering the Hunter Biden laptop because it's a non-story. That was pretty blunt. Like now they don't cover this, or they sort of downplay it in a subtler way. But at the time it was like, no, we're putting our foot down. So yeah, I was finding again and again that anything that I wanted to write about that wasn't helpful to the movement of 2020, that wasn't helpful to the activist cause, was becoming very, very hard. And when I would manage to get a story through, it made me a target. And these are all, I mean, I have the tiniest violin here, right? Like this is a target. What? So I had colleagues sending out nasty tweets about me. I had people saying mean things or sharing embarrassing photos of me as a teenager that they found on my Facebook or whatever, like internally. It's like middle school bullying. I'm not like I was fine, but it was emotionally really jarring because I had grown up in the world of kind of prestige old America where like the New York Times, by old, I mean like the old way of thinking about how the media worked and how what to want. And the New York Times was the top thing for a writer to want. That was it. That was the only dream. And so to find myself kind of all of a sudden on the outs and on the kind of being bullied, being left out, being kicked out of Slack rooms, being like all this stuff, it was really jarring. And I think, yeah, I mean, it was like kind of a moment of growing up in a lot of ways and dropping what I think of now as childish fantasies about what these places are and about what the New York Times is. And I don't think it's like a malicious place or anything, but it's a business. And it's a business that's serving an audience that wants a thing.
It's a business. So to what extent are they making business decisions and they don't really believe any of this stuff? They're just going along with the woke mob? Or are they true believers? Or some mix?
I think it's a mix. But I think that leaning in the same way that giving your audience red meat, right-wing content is good business for some media companies, giving your audience sort of blue anon, as I like to call it, like QAnon, but on the left, giving your audience sort of blue anon content and the latest like headline about how Trump is the fascist of all fascists in all history and the latest this and that. Like, I think people both believe it. And I think it's also good business. Like giving people red meat is always going to sell. And I just didn't get into journalism to give people red meat. Mm-hmm. I'm like your magazine, Skeptic. I'm just a skeptical personality. I'm a kind of, I don't, all the things about my personality that made me sometimes like a difficult kid or a difficult student actually worked really well for journalism. And I think when I was coming up in journalism at like the local paper, the San Francisco Chronicle, that was really well suited for that environment. And I think most sort of old-fashioned thoughts of the journalist are thoughts of people who are a little bit separate from their moment or a little separate from what's around them and curious about it, but skeptical. And now I think the ideal journalist for these places is not a skeptic and is not curious. The ideal journalist is basically like a party member, an activist, a very devoted activist, and hopefully a good writer, but that's almost secondary. And yeah, I think that's the transition that we all went through in 2020. And the Times kind of sloughed off a bunch of the skeptics and the worrywarts, and then everyone moves along.
So were there no sort of old school editors in there, a Ben Bradley at the Washington Post kind of guy that says, hang on, this is not our job to be activists. We're supposed to be reporters? Or are they just retired now?
There's a mix of that. I think there was, I know there was some amount of movement to stave this off. There were people reaching out to me privately and saying, I loved this story and you're so brave to have gone up and done this story, even though now people are tweeting mean things about you. And I was sort of just like, this is insane, like grown men, And yeah, there was that movement, but people were very scared and you don't want to lose your job. You have to remember in this time also Donald McNeil, who for me became a very important figure. I think he really summarized this in ways that aren't almost recognized enough. But Donald McNeil was the longtime science reporter. He was kind of a gray beard. He'd been there forever. He'd been in South Africa. He'd been all over the place. He's an amazing guy. And you don't need the whole, it's interesting. I'll tell the whole.
Recount it shortly for listeners that don't remember.
He had, on like a trip with a bunch of students, some student had asked him about whether it was fair that their friend got in trouble for using the N-word. And Donald had responded, well, what was the context that this kid used the N-word? But in asking that, he'd used the word. This happened years ago. He had been sort of properly punished for it and gotten a little censored within the Times. And I don't remember exactly the details of his punishment, but something had happened. And then years later, during the height of this movement, when I was kind of dealing with the Chaz stuff, and COVID was happening, and Donald was the lead COVID reporter. And he was a skeptic. He was not a skeptic of COVID, but he was a real reporter who wasn't just going to go along with everything. This old scandal bubbled up, and there was sort of a movement to oust him. And it was this drumbeat, and it was this like, here's this old scandal. Remember this old scandal. Hey, Donald McNeil, you should respond about this old scandal. And nothing new emerged, nothing new about him or anything. And it was used basically to fire him, to get him to resign, is I'm sure the proper term. But I remember thinking, if a place could do this to a man who devoted his whole career really selflessly to this institution, that's...
And that's happened a scary lot. Place. Is it your sense that, or what is your sense of the psychology behind that? What do they call it? Offense archaeology. We're going to look through and rummage through your old Twitter feed or whatever, and see if we can find something to get you on.
I love that term. I've never heard that. Offense archaeology. Offense archaeology.
It's not mine. I don't know where they came from, but it's true.
That's so good.
And the punishment is so dramatic. Like, you should be fired. You should lose your living, your livelihood. That's very different from, I disagree with you, let's have an argument. Something like that. That does seem worse. And it's almost like in the Middle Ages when, the worst heretics were those who were once believers and then they fall away. Those are the ones we really have to punish. So like a liberal who is skeptical or whatever, like Donald McNeil, we have to really go after him. Maybe is it a signal to other people? You better stay in line.
100%. Like, I think I was more irritating to the movement because I'm a liberal San Francisco lesbian. Like, I tick all the boxes. I believe technically in the right things politically. Like, I like universal healthcare and strong public school. You know, all these things that used to be what made you count as a good liberal. But yeah, it's definitely that it's only, this is a movement of punishment kind of within liberalism to try to move things in a wanted direction and to try to move the liberal sort of herd. But yeah, it still happens. The offense archaeology, it's really wild. And there's this bloodlust to it. So like, I think now of Rachel Dolezal, who,
right.
The listeners who don't know, Rachel Dolezal was the woman, the mom, activist who, in I think Seattle, Pacific Northwest, who was involved with the NAACP and claimed she was Black, but she wasn't. And that was found out. I think her family or whatever came forward and said she's not Black. She's involved in Black activist circles, but she identified as Black and lived in Black community and wanted to identify that way. And obviously that's a very eccentric thing. And she lost her job within the NAACP and lost her status and became kind of a social pariah. She became international news for months, like months and months. And you would think then she'd kind of be left alone. You would think that would be enough. But it's not. And so now, years later, this eccentric woman with a little odd beliefs, but relatively harmless, is trying to eke out a living. She's working part-time at a public school. She's on OnlyFans, selling pictures of herself. And people discovered this. They found this. And she again became a laughingstock. She again, the school was called. Her job again was taken from her. The photos of her OnlyFans, which, I'm sorry, all the sort of porn empowerment, sex work empowerment people suddenly use it as a cudgel when they realize the truth, which is that is not empowering. And it's used to punish her yet again years later. And that, to me, is the sort of insanity. Sorry, I'm adjusting my little headset.
But
anyways,
but why would they go after her and not lots of the other women that go on OnlyFans and make a lot of money, like Ayala, probably the most famous one that was making like $100,000 a month. And she's kind of held up as like, wow, she's an entrepreneur. Good for her. Go girl.
Because Rachel Dolezal upset the movement. She was not doing the proper things. She was embarrassing to it. She was she became kind of like a scapegoat of oddity and odd behavior. And oh, look at this white privilege. She's taking on a Black identity. And I don't know, people became obsessed with her and they became obsessed with kind of hunting her down. And so all to say, that's kind of how people treat anyone within the movement who crosses it in some way or questions it too much or seems to be potentially a dissident. And there's just like a sort of obsessive hunting that goes on for years and there's no escape from it. So like Donald McNeil will be followed by this for years. And
right. Well, a little bit like what Coleman Hughes is experiencing now by championing color blindness. You know, it's one thing for a white guy to do it and just be accused, well, you're just a white supremacist or something, but he's in the tribe. So for him to say this, you know, you probably saw, yeah, that's right. You guys even posted on The View, his appearance on The View, which was just so impressive. He was so calm.
It was phenomenal.
Yeah. And, but yeah, I guess that's the psychology of it. One of our own that falls away has to be really punished. Not only for their own indiscretions, but as a signal to everybody else, this could happen to you.
Coleman is so special.
Yeah.
That appearance on The View, he was phenomenal. I mean, for anyone who didn't see it, Sonny Hostin basically went after him and was just trying to poke holes in his argument, but he knows his argument so well. And he was so calm. And he just handled it and kind of pushed back really politely when the ladies were trying to kind of bully him in the traditional ways you might expect. And it was great. I texted my editor. We share an editor. And I said, I hope you know that if this happened to me, I would leave the stage crying. There's no way in hell I'd have that kind of calm and composure.
Well, it's like if you bring up Shelby Steele or Glenn Lowry or Thomas Sowell, you know, the response seems to be as well, they're not real black or something like that, or they're just conservatives. They've been corrupted, you know, something like that. And that's why I like what Coleman said was let's just stick to the ideas and not make it about me. It doesn't matter what I think. Who cares what I think? Let's just talk about the ideas. And it's like, what? Okay, last point on the New York Times. Yeah, I recall Barry was brought there. You know, she was my editor at the Wall Street Journal.
You're kidding.
I think it must have been right out of college. She, because I was writing book reviews for them fairly regularly, and she was my book review editor.
That's awesome.
For the
I
Wall Street
love
Journal.
that.
Yeah, so I've known her for a long.
Was she a good editor?
Oh yeah, oh absolutely, of course, yeah. And then all of a sudden I saw that she went over to the New York Times, and then the impression I got was they brought her in to have a more balanced. Not that she's a conservative, but that she's not an uber progressive liberal, maybe, or something. She's objective. She can find other voices that our readers need to hear, and she did that. And so, anyway, so let me read another portion here from your book. This is you at the Times. One early evening, I was having drinks with an editor and a group of colleagues. The editor, who I liked a lot, heard I was dating this very bad liberal. And he looked at me straight in the face and said he thought it was pretty messed up. He wanted to know, how could I do that? She's a Nazi. She's a fucking Nazi, Nellie, he said. I tried to laugh it off, and he kept going. Like, are you serious, Nellie? He lobbed another, she's a Nazi. My colleagues agreed. They kept going. He couldn't believe I would do this. Like, wow. Eventually, I got him to change the subject. You're talking about Barry there. A Nazi? I mean, what? I mean, that's pretty bad.
It was surreal. I mean, for me, it was a very hard moment, I would say. It was at the time I was jarred by it and I was upset, but it had become something akin to normal. Like it was within the energy that was building internally. And so I was sort of used to it, but yeah, it was a really upsetting moment.
But my point is that they've gone so far to the left that even a Barry Weiss is now not a centrist. She's a Nazi. I mean, a champion of Jewish causes is a Nazi, right? I mean, that's the point of that story, I think.
And it's a term now that we hear used a lot for especially against Jewish people. Mm-hmm. At the time, I'd never really heard that used for a Jewish person. It was very odd. Like, it was so strange. Why would you think of that? Like, of all the insults, it was like, why Nazi? It was so strange. But yeah, she was really a firebrand. And I could never quite figure, I always thought maybe there's some secret political thing that I'm going to learn next that's actually the secret dark politics, but I could never much figure it out myself. But yeah, I would say it became very clear that if I was going to keep being interested in stories like what I was interested in, i.e. the most interesting stories of 2020 that we were supposed to just all collectively ignore, and if I was going to keep dating Bear, then it wouldn't be possible to have a career at the Times. It wouldn't be possible. And so such is life. But yeah, so I wrote about that. That I promise that's only the first few pages of the book.
Oh,
and
no,
then it's a book and then it's a book about different places and on the ground reporting, and it is not all a woe is me.
No, I don't. I don't want
suffered.
to give that impression. My point is that it's emblematic of how far left the left has gone, to the point where maybe the better word for that is progressive rather than liberal. I mean, I trust you consider yourself a liberal still in the old traditional sense of how it's defined.
Yeah. I think I think what you saw was the splintering of the progressive. The progressive is a lot of things. The progressive versus liberal, let's say. The points of tension. I would say a major one would be like a great example would be housing. The progressive doesn't want cities to build more housing. The progressive wants the backyard gardens to stay sunny and beautiful, thinks that new market rate housing is suspicious and dangerous and capitalist. And the liberal wants more housing. The liberal wants housing next to transit. Basic old-fashioned thoughts like that. So that's it, where I come from in San Francisco. That's kind of an eternal fight where you have these people casting themselves as leftists who are arguing for policies that, of course, make the city more expensive and make it so only the extremely rich can live there. And they call anything else capitalism and neoliberalism, whatever, fascism. The progressive versus liberal in, let's say, education. The liberal would say, let's put more funding into schools. Let's make them better. Let's measure that they're getting better. Let's try to make public schools that compete with private schools and that are better than private schools. The progressive would say, let's not measure anything. Tests are all racism. Testing is a racist practice. There is no such thing as a non-racist test. That, like in San Francisco, there was, I'm referencing San Francisco a lot because a lot of this book started, and sort of in me, it started by being a San Franciscan and by loving that city and wanting it to thrive and seeing the kind of left liberal battles that were happening there. So in San Francisco, 8th grade algebra, which was offered as a test in accelerated course, a lot of the people who were testing in were young Asian students, and the progressive left decided to disband 8th grade algebra and successfully got it disbanded, and made it so it was, you couldn't have that class. 8th grade algebra became illegal, and so that's not a liberal idea. And I'd say that's kind of like what makes the progressive different, or philosophies like that.
Yeah, and the reason behind it is that if any cohort of people are falling behind on those tests, then we got to get rid of the test rather than say help those groups rise,
exactly,
pull themselves up.
It's equality of outcomes versus opportunity. Yeah. The traditional liberal response is always, you want equality of opportunities, you want great 7th grade math so that more kids can get to 8th grade algebra. The new progressive thinking is getting to 8th grade algebra should never be the goal. That's a nasty goal. And that really has been the philosophy that has won the day in our cities. I mean, it sounds crazy, and I'm maybe not arguing it well enough. I'm maybe sort of making a caricature of it, but genuinely, that is what happened in San Francisco. And that's the philosophy that's won the day in most American cities. And yeah, the American liberals have been, for the last couple of years, really on their back feet, I would say.
Yeah, I just posted this morning this story about Joe, it's a woman, Baylor, Boale.
Oh, exactly.
Stanford University math education, responsible for the new California math framework, a set of curriculum recommendations that advocate against teaching most middle schoolers algebra. Sent her own kids to a $48,000 a year private school that teaches algebra.
But that's the story every time. That's the story you're always going to find. Like it's the biggest advocates for this are people who send their kids to private school and to whom it's completely irrelevant. But the idea seems lovely. The idea seems very nice.
Is that these poor little people can't make it on their own, but I can?
No, it's that everyone should be equal and that we are equal. And it's almost religious. It's like we're all equal under God's eyes. So why should some kid be in a more advanced math class? The idea behind it, a lot of the ideas behind the progressive arguments are beautiful. And that's why they're winning. That's why they have won. So like a lot of the ideas, let's say around, I have a chapter in the book about abolish the police and the defund movement. Thanks to the crime wave, that movement did see itself eventually lose, but for years it was winning. And it was winning because it's based on a very beautiful idea, which is that people are good and people don't want to hurt each other. They don't want to steal. And if just given enough resources and therapy and community events and maybe an herb garden in the neighborhood, that people won't do crime. That's genuinely the philosophy. And that's beautiful. And I wish that were true. Like, and so you sound like an asshole if you're like, no, people are really bad. People will hurt each other. Doesn't matter if they have money, they'll still hurt each other. Doesn't matter if they have a community garden, they'll still steal from each other. Like, so I think that's in part why this movement won for so long and has won in so many places, because to argue against it is to argue in some ways that human nature is not perfect and that we need police, even if we eliminate poverty, that we still need police.
Yeah. Yeah, that's part of the progressive worldview. I think it's blank slateism, or it's what Thomas Sowell distinguished in his book. Here, I'll just read this portion of summarizing that conflict divisions. He argued that these two clusters of moral values are intimately linked to the vision one holds about human nature, either as constrained, conservative, or unconstrained, liberal. Now, I would say liberals are much more realistic now, and it's progressives that are holding this unconstrained version. He called these constrained and unconstrained. Sowell showed that controversies over a number of seemingly unrelated social issues such as taxes, welfare, social security, healthcare, criminal justice, and war repeatedly reveal consistent ideological dividing line along these two conflicting visions. Quoting from Sowell, if human options are not inherently constrained, then the presence of such repugnant and disastrous phenomenon virtually cries out for an explanation and for solutions. But if the limitations and passions of man himself are at the heart of these painful phenomena, then what requires explanation are the ways in which they can be avoided or minimalized. Right. So, yeah, it's that unconstrained, we can have a perfect utopian society if only we did X.
It's a beautiful quote.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's what's behind so many of these things you write about. So let's just talk about some of these stories. By the way, these essays are beautifully written. Were they originally a standalone essay somewhere, or are they just for this book?
The San Francisco chapter was published in The Atlantic, and that was a standalone essay.
I mean, like the one because I like your approach where you embed yourself, so to speak, an embedded journalist in the, white privilege movement, and you go to this seminar or workshop or whatever it was. Maybe it was on Zoom, but in any case, that whole Robin DiAngelo movement. What was that like? What are these people thinking? I mean, some of these passages in here are just astonishing what these people were saying. Let me just pull one up here. Right, here we go. Racism is structural. Oh, yeah. So here's some of these quotes. A woman named Mia introduces herself. She's a white woman with a biracial child and says she's scared that her whiteness could harm her child. Claudia says it's frustrating that white women were fighting patriarchy for so long, and now, just as that seems done, she feels like she's lost to her whiteness. It's like, here I am, ready to speak my truth and sort of being told to step aside. She wants to know how to do that without feeling resentment. Claire lives in Los Angeles and loves her cats. What I struggle with is how to understand all the atrocities of being a white body, being a privileged white supremacy person. Anyway, this goes on and on. You have these great quotes from all these different women. What are they thinking they're throwing themselves on their sword in this way is going to do to actually help Black people?
That's an interesting question. But yeah, so the context for this is I took a bunch of anti-racism courses over the course of reporting this book, and I write about two part of the same program. And they were over multiple days, and they featured anti-racist coaching and a lecture by Robin DiAngelo. And a lot of them are about the concept of unpacking our whiteness, unpacking the internalized white supremacy that is just being white. And what are people thinking when they're signing up for this? I think they're thinking that white privilege sounds pretty sick, and that if being white is causing pain, then they should figure out how to stop that pain. And I think they're good, kind people who are trying to stop hurting the world through their body's existence. And the class is similar to what you'll see in most kind of corporate America trainings now around these issues, most elementary schools around these issues. It starts with kind of racial awareness, becoming very aware of yourself being white, being very aware of your flesh. And then it moves into what this movement and what its leaders describe as white traits and sort of white values and how to dismantle them. So white values that they outline. And again, I'm going to be saying this, but I think this stuff is wildly racist. Not even just racist against whites. I think it's racist against non-white people. But how they define white values is timeliness. Being on time is a white value. Attention to detail is a white value.
Why?
Oh my God, the list is so crazy. It's individualism is a white value. And so it's all about carving these values out of you. So over the course of this class, over 4 days or so, people slowly tried to break themselves of these values. And it was pretty stunning to see and pretty stunning to be around, because it's so psychological. And it kind of means you have to like break your mind. And there's not an escape from it. There's never an escape from it. Now, how do they think this will help the world? Like I said, they think that their existence hurts the world, but also you're probably hearing our dog yapping
okay.
at squirrels.
We don't mind. People are used to, these are podcasts. People are used to stuff.
This is working from home has really been a bad, but now I've lost my train of thought.
Well, let me just rephrase it. Like, let's say it's all true and I have white privilege. Okay. How does this help some black guy get a lower mortgage rate on his home loan or get a raise at work? If I'm Elon Musk and I'm in a battle with Mark Cuban and Mark Cuban says, look, I buy all this stuff and I own all these companies, I'm going to change the policy. I'm going to give raises to the black people. That could happen. But these women that are in the seminar, how are they going to change those kind of very specific things?
The early anti-racist movement was more about actual tangible things and wage equity and punishing people for saying nasty things in the workplace and things like that make a lot of sense. The movement started with really concrete ideas around how to make life better for Black Americans and for people in countries outside of America who were in horrible situations. And, there are all kinds of campaigns around freedom for different peoples and whatnot. Over the years, as the therapeutic language has taken hold, as this has become, it's gone from activist corners of Berkeley to more popular, trendy corners of just like middle class, upper middle class American white ladies. It became more of an internal struggle. So the anti-racist teachers, the Robin DiAngelos of the world, would say that the most important thing is to fix yourself internally, and that it's not necessarily about fixing the boardroom or it's not about any concrete thing. It's a therapeutic psychological battle within yourself as a white person. And like a lot of the stuff, that kind of won. And that became the dominant anti-racist move. And so to do anti-racism was to join one of these groups and was to participate in this kind of psychological game around rooting out your internal whiteness, rooting out these values that were poisoning the world. And like you say, yeah, it has nothing to do with making life better for Black Americans. It doesn't give tangible benefits. It would be better if people just like wrote checks, basically, or I mean, I could think of a lot of things that would probably do more efficient things. But as a writer, it was very rich, the psychological movement of it all.
These essays you write are pretty non-judgmental. You know, a lot of these I'm reading thinking, this is just grade A prime cut bullshit. How is she not screaming at these people? This is just insane what they're saying. I mean, again, back to that point, it's one thing, there are still some racist assholes out there. There's misogynists, there's homophobes and so on. They are out there. They're not going to take these courses.
Exactly.
I mean, so Who are these for? You know, these are for good liberals like you that don't have a racist bone in your body.
Well, they would certainly not say that any of us don't have a racist bone in our bodies.
Even if you don't know it, I guess it's unconscious.
Yeah.
Or systemic.
Yeah, it's the way you move through the world. It's yeah, I mean, it, like so much of this time, it's been about a kind of reformation or a revolution inside progressivism. It's not about reaching out and changing someone else's mind. It's not about converting a Trumper to a liberal or a this to a that. Like, it has nothing to do with that. And actually, it sort of sees that as grotesque and as like, if you're a conservative already, if you vote for Donald Trump, then like you are so far beyond the pale that even talking to that person would be like high risk morally, like really gross, freaky, dangerous. And so there's no effort to like reach out to people who don't already agree. It's just a movement of radicalizing the already agreeing and of sort of pushing the liberal left and of pushing, kind of radicalizing the center leftward.
Right. Here's the thought I had for the last few years on this idea of white privilege. Do I have it? Or is it that, I have whatever the default is of the American system, and some people don't have it because the American system has, frankly, historically, not been very fair. A lot of people have not had the opportunities, and we're thankfully doing something about that now in the last half century or so. But so, is it a push or a pull or a negative or a positive? How do you think about that?
Which part?
Well, the part that, in other words, it's not that I have privilege for being white. It's that other people don't have the default. I just have the default. There's nobody holding me back. I just do whatever I want to do. And other people are held back. And that's the problem. I'm not the problem. The problem is the system itself is holding people back. Even if it's not held back by racist people, the system is systemically racist. Not redlining in real estate, for example, because that's been outlawed now, but apparently there are still discrepancies in these neighborhoods 50 years after the fact where, so on, that kind of stuff still exists.
I mean, I think there's structural problems, and I think also that there are racist individuals. Yeah. I think that there's plenty of racism in America. Like, I would never say there isn't. I think it's obviously a problem that should be fixed. Obviously, we have horrible schools that are predominantly filled with minority kids who are getting a subpar education. Yeah. And like, that's awful. And that's appalling. And those are the battles that liberals historically fought. And to me, it's the turn towards the psychological and the turn towards saying, actually, instead of making the school better, instead of making things better for a Black American family who wants to succeed and wants to have a good jobs and good home in a nice neighborhood, all this stuff, instead of improving those things, let's try to sort of hurt the schools that are doing better or hurt the kids that are doing better. And it's a scarcity mindset and a kind of anti-progress mindset. like it doesn't actually want it. Yeah, I guess scarcity mindset is the way to think of it. That like the only reason that one person is succeeding is because someone else is failing, rather than thinking, let's see how we can get that failing school to be better. But yeah, I mean, fundamentally, of course, these issues are real issues, and that's why these movements struck a chord. They hit and they work, and BLM as a movement can take off because clearly there's bias and clearly there's racism, and to deny that is foolish. But at the same time, like there's a chapter in the book about the BLM and some of the money stuff, and basically what happened was the movement raised a ton of money. And because reporters were too scared to report on what was going on and where it was being spent and how it was being raised, it was allowed to basically be scammed away, allowed to be spent in whatever way the small group of founders decided they wanted to spend all the BLM funds. Enormous amounts of money were raised by this group, raised on the names of dead Black children. I mean, raised in very intense ways. And you now see the parents of those children writing letters telling the group to stop and all this stuff. But because the American media was basically told you can't report on this, or you'll be sort of pushed out of whatever place you're at, it was allowed to steal and to do actually the opposite of anything helpful. And so if you believe in these values, you should want it. You should want a good, non-corrupt BLM. Mm-hmm. It's basically my argument.
Yeah. So in meeting some of these people, like say some of the Antifa people that you met and so on, another question I had is just say take the January 6th riots. How many are there true believer MAGA people versus just people that like to stir shit up? And or maybe this is my rights revolution. I didn't get the civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, but this is the next big one, and I want a part of it. Whatever it is, defund the police, or BLM, or Me Too, or white privilege. I'm just going to jump in there because I want to do something.
I think people like revolution. I think people like its action, right? Remember, we were all in the heat of this. A lot of this, we were in lockdown.
Yeah,
we were isolated, and this was action. It was fun. It was communal. So in one of the chapters, I report on Antifa and Antifa's kind of actions in the Pacific Northwest, and how popular it was getting, how big, and how actually a lot of the sort of traditional, or a lot of the BLM events were being overshadowed by the Antifa events, which were really the dominant movement up there. And first, obviously, there was a concerted effort to ignore what was going on, even as these groups of kids with guns were taking over entire neighborhoods of great American cities. I mean, which is just made for these amazing scenes. I mean, there's in Seattle, there were kids in Seattle. The gay neighborhood was taken over and renamed Chaz. Eventually, they called it CHOP. I don't really know why they changed the name, but it was taken over by a group of Antifa activists, and they sat around. They blockaded the streets, and they sat in lawn chairs with guns across their laps. I mean, it was surreal scenes of real, even small, but real efforts at revolution. And I mean, how many are true believers versus just there for the fun? You could ask that of any revolutionary movement. Yeah. I think a lot of people are just there for fun, and then there's probably a few smart people who are kind of leading the thing, like any other movement.
But take the smart ones that are true believers. What did they think they were going to do once they had the neighborhood or they had the power? It's the same question I asked about the January 6th people. Had they gotten Nancy Pelosi, what were they going to do then?
Jesus.
I mean, take over the government?
I don't want to know.
I think
they did. Yeah.
I mean, were they going to like propose new bills and take a vote on it? Were they going to do procedural, boring, bureaucratic red tape stuff? No. So what,
I think they thought that they were going to show how beautiful the world they could create would be. Just how good it was going to be. And when you say no cops are allowed here, when you say we're going to make our own ambulance system, we're going to make our own, it's the dream of anyone who's starting like any utopia. It's we're going to do it fresh and we're going to finally get it right. And I think they really thought that. I don't think that those guys were lying. There's no financial incentive to taking over Seattle's gay neighborhood. I mean, it was a utopian project. And the fact that people were killed, the fact that children were killed in there, teenagers, sorry, I shouldn't say children, was inconvenient and problematic, but revolution takes time, was sort of the argument, and change is hard. And I think that, now you have a reckoning. Now you have the families of those who were shot trying to sue the city and say, how could you have abandoned this place where police cars would refuse to go, where ambulances wouldn't go, where people were allowed to bleed out.
Yeah.
Like how could the city allow this? And now you have the battle, and of course the payouts and all of that. But that was.
Yeah, I posted on Twitter the last sentences of your chapter on that. And quietly, almost exactly 3 years after the neighborhood was first taken over and renamed Chaz, the ice cream shop owner Molly Moon Neitzel filed a lawsuit against the city. She wanted to be really clear that she still supports the police-free utopia, but that also the city needs to pay her for having abolished the police in the police-free utopia. This lawsuit does not seek to undermine Chaz participants' message or present a counter-message, her lawyers wrote. Rather, this lawsuit is about plaintiffs' constitutional and other legal rights, of which were overrun by the city of Seattle's decision to abandon and close off an entire city neighborhood, leaving it unchecked by the police. Again, this is like an Onion type story. You just can't make this up. It's astonishing.
Well, you gotta love lawyers.
Yeah,
you gotta love lawyers, because the lawyers managed to say both that this I'm sure very sweet ice cream shop owner does want to abolish the police and supports all the Chaz philosophies around abolishing the police, all the Antifa, but also is suing the city for abolishing the police. I mean, it's
yeah, I know.
You can't make it up.
Did you meet anybody in any of these movements that was like an MLK or a Malcolm X or a Lenin or somebody with an actual like model of here's how we're going to get from here to there over the next 20 years through reform, through legal change, through lawsuits or whatever? Or are they more spontaneous in the moment?
It was more spontaneous in the moment. I don't think we're at the point yet where we have that character. I do think you're right, though, to point out that someone like that will emerge. A lot of the sort of more famous characters who I write about are, like, I would say the leaders of BLM are mostly in it for cash and for the expense accounts and to use the funds to buy a party house and like stuff that is human and understandable, but not very like exciting or inspirational. I don't think there is the kind of MLK of it all yet, but I think there could be. I think there's potential for someone like that to arise who's not a corrupt figure and who just believes in these things. And I think that'd be pretty exciting, pretty interesting.
Yeah. Yeah,
but I don't know. Do you think there's anyone like that?
No, I've not. Well, I mean, someone like Ibram X. Kendi, I suppose, thinks of himself that way. I don't think he's the right person for that.
Yeah.
But at least trying to lay out an intellectual foundation for the movement where you go from there.
And it's sort of political.
I mean, there's other, arguments for reparations, for example, where they actually try to make a case by putting some numbers on what was lost in slavery. Of course, you'd have to apply that same reasoning to the Native Americans, and what was lost, all that land is probably even more valuable, and so on. But, I think something like that, and, I wrote The Moral Arc, so that was published 2015, just as the Supreme Court voted to make same-sex marriage the law of the land. Okay, so it seemed like we've made it, right? And then all this other shit starts going, the Me Too movement, BLM, George Floyd, and all these things. And it's like, oh, there's something else going on here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the broader question you're asking is basically there's a long march of liberalism towards ever more sort of progressive philosophies. And who are we to ever say, stop here or don't go there? And I think it's a really interesting argument, and it's one I kind of wrestle with. And you could also go the opposite direction, and you could say, well, okay, we should walk that back. We should walk back. And I mean, you could end up arguing yourself all the way to women shouldn't have the right to vote, right? Like liberalism begins a little while ago now. I think throughout the movement to, let's say, gain my rights, the right to vote, the right to marry, it was often the moderate who got that win. So let's say the right for gay marriage was won not by the radical chic activists. It was won by the practical people who said, this is better for our taxes, and this is we deserve this kind of economically, if nothing else. And the radicals actually were anti the gay marriage fight, and anti-gay marriage as a priority, and anti-gay marriage as an idea, because marriage was heterosexual, it was heteronormative, it was capitalist, it was all the things that were bad, and so it was not considered the chic leftist thing at all. And the people who won it were for a long time, or the people who argued for it early on were for a long time kind of shamed for that. But more broadly, I mean, it's something to wrestle with constantly. And I think that we're at the point now where some of these things are in conflict. So let's say trans participation in sports, in women's sports. You would have the New Progressive saying that the next step in the march of progress is for anyone who identifies as a man or as a teen boy to be able, or as a teen, anyone who identifies as a woman or as a teen girl should be able to participate in women's sports, girls' sports. And that's the next step. But is that as a person who believes in women's sports, is that actually a progressive step in a fair playing field for teen girls? I mean, like that
No.
To me, no. Like I would say that doesn't intuitively make sense, and I don't think that's a step forward in some march of progress. Like I think that's a lie, and it's a lie to say that that's the step forward. It's not, and that actually kind of is a step backwards for women's sports to say that anyone who identifies a certain way is allowed to play in those in those matches. And the movement uses the language of liberalism. It says, how pedantic to have women's sports be separated. Do you not think women are strong enough? Do you not think women are good enough to play against biological males? Like how sexist of you. And these are arguments that will be used often. And it's like, well, I'm not sexist, but I do know that there are certain physical differences between men and women, or males and females. And I don't know what to say. Like, that just is what it is. I can't open a jar of pickles. Like I don't know how to have that argument.
Yes.
And they'll often break it down to little scientific things like, oh, well, testosterone or this or that. And it's like, anyways. So yes, there's the long march of progressivism and the long march towards more liberal things. And that march has gotten me so much. I mean, me personally, I'm a woman with my own bank account. I'm married to a woman. Like these are miracles that I can enjoy because of fights of earlier generations of people who dedicated themselves to get those miracles. At the same time, I don't think it means you have to blindly take anything that someone says is the next step in this march and say, okay, great, I'm on board. I don't think that's what it means. It doesn't mean that for me. Yeah, I think the women's sports participation is kind of the perfect example. And it almost makes you feel a little crazy having to make these arguments, because it's just like, how is it controversial for me to be saying that women's sports would be decimated if there weren't gender rules? Like, it's...
So there, I think Thomas Sowell had this great line about there's no solutions, they're just compromises in society. And I think that's the case. There's what you might consider conflicting rights. A lot of, rights issues come down to conflicting rights. We can't have everything. Right? Abortion, it's the rights of the fetus to live, the rights of the mother to choose, and so on. And so we vote, or we get the judges we want, or we fight about it politically. In the case of sports, it would be nice if we just let anybody do whatever they want, but there's a reason we don't, because it's not fair. So we have to have rules about this. Then you have the more ontological question. That is, can you actually change your sex? Not gender, but sex, your biological sex. And this seems to be where the tension is. Most of us are a little more open about the idea of gender being socially constructed. People have these different identifications. But actual changing the biology, I think most of the consensus among scientists is that you can't actually do that. And then you have this kind of a dualism, a Cartesian dualism of, I'm in the wrong body. Well, there's no you and your body. You are your body. And all of this goes back to a very ancient idea where we are kind of natural-born dualists, that we feel like there's a mind inside my brain that's separate from the brain. There's a soul separate from my body. And when I die, it floats off and goes off into the quantum ether or wherever it goes, right? I mean, that's pretty natural. Most people, the research on this from cognitive psychologists is super interesting. You watch a film like Freaky Friday, where Lindsay Lohan and Jamie Lee Curtis switch bodies and hilarity ensues, right? Yeah, but there's no switching. You are your body. There's nothing to switch, right? There's no soul. There's no mind. There's no gender, girl, male inside your female body. There's no such thing. but there's no soul, there's no mind. Them's fighting words. Well, I know. I'm a full-on materialist monist. I think these are just words we use. And I'm probably in the minority on that position. So if you want to push back, that's fine. But I think that is what's in part fueling.
I think one thing that the movement's done that's very odd to me is this sex and gender breakdown. So how it was taught to me in my great sort of feminist all-girls schools, and how I originally read Judith Butler, who argued this, although now Judith Butler is changing their tone on this. But it was that gender is a construct, that gender is like an activity we play as a society. And that makes intuitive sense. Like, you look at the color pink, or I remember there's the classic example, like pink used to be coded male and then it became coded female, and like all of these different things that let you know that you're just playing with gender and it's all show. And so of course you can change your gender and you can present as a male, as a man, you can present as a woman, and that intuitively makes total sense. And I think that people should be obviously allowed to change their gender. It's not even a question of allowed. The state should have no involvement with it. And they should be able to live however they want to live and all this. Your sex, I don't know what it means to say that that your sex changes versus your gender changes. I mean, I don't we have the genes we have, and it just is what it is. And I don't think that means that we shouldn't treat trans people with respect, and that if someone's discriminated against for being trans that by their employer, that employer should be in trouble. All of these things have rights. But the erasure of the sex-gender divide is a really weird thing, because, yeah, I think it's very much a losing argument for that movement. And it's become, for whatever reason, their central argument. And the whatever reason is because the movement now says that it wants people with penises to be in women's prisons and all of this, and that shouldn't be questioned. So yeah, that's why it's necessary. But it seems like a very chaotic breakdown and a mess and a losing battle. And it's yeah.
Well, you've probably seen that, the Tavistock Clinic was closed in London, and the UK Health Service is banned now cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers and things like that. You probably saw the WPATH files that Michael Schellenberg released, where, for years, these so-called experts, these are PhDs, MDs, psychiatrists, surgeons, and so on, talking amongst themselves and answering questions of doctors who are contemplating doing these surgeries or implementing these hormonal treatments to teenagers, underage, minors, asking, well, do we know anything about the long-term consequences for fertility or their sexuality when they're adults? And the answer was no, we don't know anything. And then the next line is, well, let's just do it anyway. Like, wait, what? So, the revelations have been, the research, the science was never there to say this is okay. And again, let's just separate that, minors versus adults, somebody who's of age and says, this is what I'm going to do. You do what you do you. I'm going to do me. This is what I got to do. I don't feel
God
right.
Bless.
And I'm going to take the surgery or what I'm going to do. Fine. But that's not what we're talking about here with underage kids.
Yeah. And a lot of the ideas that became very popular in this movement, which again, positioned itself as the next step in progressivism, were these, and I write about it in the book in the last couple chapters, the ideas behind it were these very curiously old-fashioned, very sexist ideas. It was ideas like if your toddler girl tears off her beret and likes to wear boys' clothes, and that's a gender message that child is sending you. And if your toddler boy is trying on his mom's shoes, that's a gender message, and you should pay a lot of attention to that. And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, kids are playing around with these things, and the idea that there's some like essential femaleness to fluffy skirts is, to my like old-fashioned feminist mind, quite sexist. Like, I wear pants. Am I questioning my sex? Because and that all comes down to the erasure between sex and gender. So the kind of playfulness of gender and became erased, and everything became about the body and changing the body. And so, yeah, over the last few years, we've seen the movement start to change young people's bodies, and we have no idea what happens. I mean, even something as simple, a lot of people will say to critics, well, surgeries were very rare. Hysterectomies or mastectomies, those things are very rare for children, for teenagers. Mastectomies maybe a little bit, but even that very rare. And yes, those were very rare. But what was a lot more common were hormones. And it would start with puberty blockers, and then it would be testosterone. And there's kind of like an effort to pretend like giving a teenage female testosterone is minor. It's just a pill. But to be honest, a mastectomy is more minor than testosterone therapy for a teen, because it changes you forever. Both change you forever. But one, if you take testosterone, your face changes, your voice changes, your bones change, your hair changes in ways that you can never, if you change your mind in a few years, you can never reverse. It doesn't go back. Your jawbone doesn't go back to what a biological female jaw would look like at that age. Whereas, anyways, this is me arguing between what's worse, mastectomies or testosterones for 15-year-olds. But yeah, it just became very, very strange, I would say, what won out. And the Schellenberger and the WPATH files and what you're seeing now is all moderate voices. Moderate, what does even these politics mean? All voices who are a little bit skeptical of the sort of most extreme version of this. Anyone who said, maybe we should have a few more therapy sessions, or maybe this kid has autism and also they were abused, and should we give them hormone therapy yet? All of those voices were completely shunned, completely censored, often ousted from clinics. And you see them now as whistleblowers. We published one of these whistleblowers, a very brave woman named Jamie Reed, who's phenomenal. A gay woman married to a non-binary person. I mean, whose sort of biography makes her unimpeachable in a lot of ways. And the backlash she faced and the backlash that the mainstream liberal world was trying to smear her with. I mean, it was shocking. And in retrospect, that a lot of that backlash was kind of like the death knell of this movement. It was like kind of people like freaking out because they knew that it was losing. And they knew that it's not unreasonable or transphobic to say that a 14-year-old girl should maybe have some counseling before we right away give her testosterone. Like, these are really reasonable positions. And the movement has very successfully smeared any dissidents for many years. And I think now we're finally starting to see dissidents coming at her saying, this is nonsense. Like, to go back to an earlier chapter, timeliness is not racism.
Yeah.
Individualism is not a white trait. That's crazy. And why weren't we allowed to say that for a few years? Like, that's crazy. So I think the title of the book is Morning After the Revolution, because in certain ways, obviously, this movement is still going. Obviously, if I don't know, there was just a Free Beacon expose about some insanity at UCLA Medical School. So I'm not going to pretend this thing is done by any means, but I think the normal moderates, the normal liberals are finally kind of speaking out and starting to say, we're not going to be smeared for saying reasonable, normal things.
So is that in part not only your book, but also the free press and the efforts that you centrist liberals, or whatever you want to call yourselves, not progressives,
fascist,
you're hoping to, that's right, neo-Nazis, hoping to,
yeah, exactly. That's the term I was
you're
looking
really
for.
Fighting a culture war, which I support. Unlike, say, maybe Chris Rufo, who wants to actually change laws, which I'm always kind of questionable about. I don't like the state getting involved in these issues. You know, maybe sometimes it's inevitable, but I mean, so fights over words, you know, pronouns, or, oh, I meant to ask you about, you know, black bodies. And now I see in your chapter on white privilege that they were talking about white bodies. What does that mean? Why are they reducing humans to just bodies? What does that mean?
Because this is a really reductive movement in a lot of ways, and it's obsessed with skin color. I mean, I wish there was there are more poetic ways to say it, but a lot of it is just an obsession with skin color and with race, and it wants to reduce us to these very simplistic categories and to just our visual identifiers. So, yeah, and it's like a dehumanizing term, the idea of black bodies, white bodies, like that we're just these kind of balls of colored flesh wandering around.
All right, you and I are both.
Although you now not believing in a soul, I don't know.
Yes,
you might start.
Right.
You might start picking up some of this.
So you and I are both in Southern California. We know a lot of Latinos and Latinas. I don't know any Latinxes. Do you know anybody that uses that term? That actually would use the term?
One of my favorite threads in all of this was the effort to make Latinx a thing, and they really got far. I mean, they had the White House. They had the American power using Latinx or Latinx or whatever it is, Latinx. I don't know the pronunciation. I refuse to learn the proper pronunciation. I've heard them all. Yes, this was an effort to make the term Latino non-binary. And so, because Latino is male and Latina is female, and so everyone should be Latinx. It was basically an effort to just signal a certain political thing. But no, I've never met anyone who identifies that way. And most polls show that actually Latino people find it quite offensive to be called Latinx. And it was interesting. I mean, one of the scenes that I reported on was a homeless encampment in a largely Latino neighborhood that was kind of taken over or run and organized by white Democratic Socialists of America and white sort of leftist activists.
Oh, yeah.
And the racial dynamics of that were fascinating because you had a bunch of these socialists living in with local homeless folks, taking over the neighborhood's one park and making it into kind of another of these anarchist home bases. Very trendy, kind of chic. Like whenever the police would try to close it down, there'd be like trendy, like Vice reporters protesting with everyone else, like to keep it open. And the people who were trying to fight it were local Latino families who were like, we use this park. This is our park. We have our family events in this park. And so the racial dynamics, I mean, so much of the last few years have been a battle within kind of elite white American communities. And it often had nothing to do with or vaguely annoyed or hurt local communities of color, as the movement would call them. And I'm not the first to point this out. I mean, like you have Batya Ungar Sargon points this out all the time. Rob Henderson coined the term luxury beliefs. Like this is a long explained phenomenon, but it's still a phenomenon. It's still very funny. And so I was just reporting on it and kind of pointing out the humor of it all. But yes, the white/Latino battlegrounds were very odd. Yeah. And no one wants to be called Latinx.
No. All right. So you guys have also been following and supporting Jonathan Haidt's research in his new book, The Anxious Generation. You know, but it's an open debate what the cause of the spike in teen depression, anxiety, cutting, suicidal ideation, anorexia, and so on. What are your thoughts on how that debate may play out? That is, you know, is it bad parenting? Is it bad therapy, like Abigail Schreier writes about? Is it too much FaceTime, too much social or screen time, Facebook? Is it, social media? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that big ongoing debate?
I think Abigail Schreier and Jonathan Haidt are both totally correct in their assessment of it. I think Abigail writes about the therapeutic mindset and the idea that instead of raising resilient kids, we're raising kids to think of themselves as traumatized at all times, and kind of making everything into like a clinical, almost medical diagnosis. So she writes about how now instead of saying someone's shy, we say they have social anxiety. Everything is in this medicalized, really dramatic language that becomes an entrapment for kids who think of themselves then as ill or as weak. And all of these things are impossible to overcome. Like you can talk about overcoming shyness, but it's a lot harder to talk about overcoming your social anxiety. And then Jonathan Haidt, I totally buy the argument that phones are making us crazy. And especially that social media for little kids, like 13-year-old girls, is taking a stressful age and kind of putting a blowtorch to it. Like, it's like, I can't imagine if we had that when I was a teenager. Facebook came online just as I was going to college, thankfully. But yeah, they're both right. And there's been, of course, well, I think the phone thing we're finally seeing more consensus on. For a while, the idea of demonizing phones was considered like, it's like, are you like a Mormon homesteader? Like, everyone needs phones, everyone needs computers. And now I think there's finally a sort of broader consensus that among parents that these things are uniquely dangerous for kids. If nothing else, then even if you don't think that the hour on the phone is bad, it's an hour taken away from an activity that might be better.
Opportunity cost.
Yeah. So you see kids, I mean, they're not having sex until much later. They're not drinking as much. All of these things that were the joys of being a teenager. I don't know.
Some of that might be good, actually.
No, I know. I think some parents are happy because the phone kind of neuters their teenager, and the phone kind of placates and pacifies this wild creature that is in their house.
I do have a question on the data itself. I'm going to ask Jonathan about this when he comes on next week.
Oh yeah, I don't know. I don't know the deep dive on the data.
But I think it's an open question. That is to say, how big is that spike really? What if some of it is not just an expansion of the category of depression or anxiety or whatever, so you throw more people in that bin, but also some of it is self-fulfilling in the way that Abigail says. That is, normal teenage sadness or anxiousness or whatever is now pathologized, and then the person themselves start thinking, well, maybe I am depressed. I have depression. And then the survey taker comes around and they go, yeah, I tick the box, or I am depressed. Or they answer those questions on the surveys. Do you ever feel this? Do you ever feel that? And they go, yeah, I do. 3 times a week. Yeah, my therapist told me so. And so they get the data point. They're in that data point that's a spike. But it's not really a spike. It's an artificial spike that's self-generated through the process that Abigail says. Versus it's really driven by screen time, social media, and so on. I don't know the answer to this. Maybe nobody does, but it's an open question, I think.
I'm willing to believe. I obviously think Abs is right, and I'm willing to believe that having a piece of black glass in your phone that connects you to the world, to everyone you've ever known, allows you to broadcast. I mean, these are radically new things, and I don't know that Jonathan Haidt even goes far enough in terms of recognizing how deeply new this all is for humans to manage. Yeah, I mean, we're all just like living in it, in the experiment of it. So it's hard to step back and see it, but I hope at some point our descendants will look at our era and say, oh my God, how stressful that must have been for them to figure out all the rules around this, to figure out all the
descendants. Nellie, this is probably going to all play out in the next year. And then in 2 years from now, there'll be some other crazy revolution that we don't
I'm not ready.
All right. Morning after the revolution. What else do you see coming? I mean, if you can project at all, what would be the next thing that everybody's going to be riled up about, that you're gonna go off and embed yourself into?
The next thing I want to write is a book of fiction. I want to do short stories.
Really? Oh, well, good, because you're a really good writer. You're a great writer.
I kind of want to do fiction. Thank you. I want to do fiction, I think. What's the next? I think we're in this one for a little while longer. I would like to say it's all over and there's going to be, a whole new set of conversations, but I don't think we're done with this one yet, is what I would say. Like, I don't think the movement's done quite yet with us.
Yeah. It could, because it does touch on those deeper issues of human nature and society and the way we want to structure it, which is a never-ending conversation that just goes from one generation to the next. That's what politics is all about. There's no empirical truths to be discovered so much as battles to be fought over conflicting rights.
Yeah. I love how you phrase it that way. I think the battle over conflicting rights is exactly right.
By the way, you're such a good writer. I really admire your writing. And I always like to ask writer, how do you write? Do you get up every morning? I'm going to knock out 3,000 words, or do you have a structure?
I don't have a really good structure. The only thing I have a very good structure for is my Friday column, where I wake up Thursday morning really early and I just write all day and nothing can interrupt me. That's the only day I'm really like a fascist about. But no, I don't have like a beautiful system. I probably should like invent one.
You're always joking about, sort of half joking about being a Hillary fan. You were a Hillary fan, right? Seriously.
Hell yeah. Are you kidding?
Yeah. Well, this is another one of these conversations I have in my head about, are we, the rise of Trump and authoritarianism and populism and Putin and this and that. Is this really a trend, or is it just a little quirky contingent moment in time?
It's interesting to think, would American liberalism have radicalized like it did if Hillary had won? And to some extent, I don't think so. To some extent, I think Trump was such a galvanizing character and so upsetting for people and so radical in his own right, in his language, in his how he carries himself, how he moves through the world, how he acted as president, how he spoke as president, that it was like destabilizing and radicalizing. And a lot of people have written about like whatever norms, and our norms fell apart. And you could say that, yeah, our norms kind of fell apart. And I think at the time when some of those people were saying, oh, Trump is the norm breaking, another norm broken, unprecedented, I sort of thought it was like, I would roll my eyes at a certain point because it was like, oh my God, everything's unprecedented, everything is this. But it was true, and it did seismically shift conversations and allow for more radical voices on the left and the right. Like the topic of this book is my world, which is the American liberalism, blue cities. That's where I live. That's what I write about. But yeah, I think Trump's presidency definitely allowed for the chaos that we saw unfold. And you see, I mean, it's less relevant in cities and universities and kind of the worlds that I move in, but you obviously see a similar irrational, radical, bizarre movement on the right as arose on the left. And you could argue, oh, the right kept it down more, or kind of like kept their moderates. I don't know if that's true though. And yeah. If my president, if Hillary Clinton had won, we'd all be reasonable and calm. America would be just like a peaceful, bucolic land of moderate liberals and moderate conservatives quietly arguing over dinner parties.
Are you worried about the 2024 election? Are you guys going to cover it in the free press? And
I'm worried about it as a writer, because what is new to say about Trump and Biden?
Nothing.
Like, I've never been more bored by two people in my life. Like, I can't believe I have to think about them more. It's just, that's how I'm worried. Are you worried about it?
Not that much, although some of my liberal friends are. You know, you hear the rhetoric, this is our last election if Trump wins. I mean, there was Robert De Niro and Bill Maher going, you know, if Trump wins, your show's going to be canceled. How's Trump going to cancel real time? I mean, unless he bought HBO and fired him or something. I mean, I don't think
he has the cash anymore.
He doesn't have any cash to buy HBO, right? And, you know, wouldn't the Supreme Court have something to say about, you know, somebody that says, you know, we're not going to have any more elections? I mean, how would that even happen? I don't see that. You know, on the plus side, Biden he's in the White House. Trump left. He didn't want to leave, but, you know, he's gone. So I don't know. I tend to think our system is pretty robust.
Yeah, I think some of the hyperbolic language is unnecessary. I mean, you can argue that Trump was a bad president, or that Trump did XYZ bad thing without resorting to hyperbole, which undermines the whole thing. Like, I don't know if you saw the bloodbath comment of last week.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, right? Like, it's like Trump says lots of crazy stuff or bad ideas all the time. Like, that idea he was talking about when he said the bloodbath thing of a huge tariff on all imported goods is bad. But the media, of course, clung on to the bloodbath comment, and it became this whole cycle around how Trump's going to slaughter all of Democrats. It's like, guys, like, you don't need to go to the looniest interpretation of things to say that this is not a good idea, or that this guy is acting like a jackass, or whatever you want to say. Like,
well, we'll have you on after the election. It'll be the morning after the election, after the revolution. Dispatches from the Wrong Side of History by Nellie Bowles. Get this book; it's a great read, big fun. And thank you so much for your work. And thank you for thank God it's Friday, because that's big fun. I love how you have people take a picture of their screen reading your column from around the world. That's really clever. I really love that.
It's a lot of fun, Michael. Thank you so much.